Fueling a Green Recovery, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. The transition to more environmentally sustainable energy practices is often viewed as incompatible with a pro-growth economic agenda. In the current gloomy economic climate, some policymakers have suggested that environmental issues must remain on hold until the economy rebounds. A growing number of economists, however, are taking a contrary view, arguing that a robust program of green investment now will fuel economic recovery and better position the nation for long-term economic growth. To help us explore the connection between sustainability and economic recovery, we're joined by a prominent national proponent of a green stimulus program. Robert Pollin is a professor of economics and co-director of the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. A prolific writer, he most recently co-authored Green Recovery, a program to create good jobs and start building a low-carbon economy, which explores the broader economic benefits from large-scale investments in clean energy in the United States. He previously held positions with the United Nations Development Program, the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress, and the U.S. Competitiveness Council. Robert, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, before we get into the mechanics of investments in green technologies and jobs in the U.S. and how that would work in this rather turbulent economic climate, I'm wondering if we could shift outward and look at what are the stakes internationally for the United States, both in terms of its ability to compete economically and also politically with its relationships with energy-producing regions of the world, the Middle East, Venezuela, et cetera. So I'm wondering if you could talk maybe some about, on the economic side, internationally,
Sure.
What's at stake for the United States?
Sure. Well, I think there's a huge amount at stake internationally, and I can think of two or three really, really important areas. One is, let's start with the biggest one, our moral standing. We have the global problem of greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. That is a problem that is confronting all of humanity and that needs to be solved over a generation. The United States is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, so we are the biggest cause of the problem. We consume about 25% of all fossil fuels. Now, in order for us to go around and saying, as we're trying to do, as actually Secretary of State Clinton was discussing in China just a few days ago, that we would like China, we would like India to start reducing their consumption of coal and other fossil fuels, we don't really have a leg to stand on there until we take some dramatic action of reducing our own consumption. So that's point one. Point two is that the U.S. has faced a persistent trade deficit. That is, we import way more than we export. And that has created significant problems in our economy. And the biggest single source, the biggest hole in our trade deficit is foreign oil.
It's not the cheap undergarments that go to Walmart.
That's there, but 25% of our total imports are foreign oil. Now, it's true, I mean, the image is that it may all be coming from Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, but the biggest single exporter into the United States of oil is Canada. Be that as it may, our oil imports are the biggest single source of our trade deficit. So to the degree we can shift out of a fossil fuel economy into a clean energy economy, we reduce our trade deficit. Everybody talks about how the Chinese are holding all of our dollars and so forth. Well, those problems start to diminish, and then we also have less difficulty managing our economy. And then third, of course, is to the degree we become less dependent on foreign oil, all the political ramifications that are tied in, obviously, with the Middle East, obviously with Venezuela, those also become diminished. So along those three dimensions, the broad moral dimension, the issue of our trade deficit, and the politics of the Middle East and oil, all of those help to get solved when we can grab hold of this problem of being so dependent on oil and other fossil fuels.
In regard to India and China, on the economic side, some have argued that the reason they couldn't support the Kyoto protocols and other international agreements to reduce carbon emissions is that we would put us at a disadvantage relative to those economies, because the United States would get more of a constraint than, say, India and China would. How does repositioning the U.S. economy away from a carbon economy to a non-carbon economy, how does it help us with that argument?
Yeah, well, in my view, over the next generation, we must transition out of being a fossil fuel dependent economy. And so the faster we realize that in our heads and start making steps forward, that is going to be healthy for our economy. And now, you began the program with a very useful reminder. It was only a couple years ago that the dominant position, certainly among economists and other people commenting on this issue, that sure, we can clean the economy, we can reduce global warming, but there's going to be major economic sacrifices, and that's what's holding us back. There's still a lot of very prominent people who make that argument. Now, what I and others have tried to show is that you can actually turn that argument on its head, and we try to show, and think of this as a massive investment program in new technologies and existing technologies that just need to be supported, like retrofitting buildings. The technologies are known. The payoffs happen in a couple of years. Think of those as investments, and you actually have lower energy bills. If we take the lead in that and transform our economy, that strengthens our economy. That gives us more bargaining power vis-a-vis China, India, everybody else. And, look, China and India, they're fast-growing economies, but the overwhelming majority of the people in those countries are very, very poor. We have the resources to develop the new technologies, to advance rapidly, to be the global innovator. That's where we should be.
Another on the international side, another topic that comes up a lot is sort of the resource competition, where you have limited stocks of oil, or at least undiscovered oil, and so on around the world. And you've got India and China and the United States and others going after those resources. What happens with that competition? I mean, would it in fact allow us to sort of bypass that in a way and not be one of those competitors going after this limited resource?
Yeah, I mean, I think, not that it necessarily will happen, I can envision us being a 100% clean energy economy in 25 years if we took concerted efforts. I mean, some people talk about the Apollo program, which was to put a man on the moon. Kennedy just said, we're going to do this. He had no idea at the time how the U.S. was going to accomplish it. But we committed to it, and we actually did achieve it. And that's why there is actually a group called the Apollo Alliance that tries to recapture the spirit of the U.S. Apollo program in the 1960s. This can be done. And it has to be done at some level. So to the degree we shift percentage by percentage off of fossil fuels and onto clean energy and conservation, which, by the way, is the biggest resource sitting there, becoming more efficient, then we don't buy the oil. And so that the leverage that the international oil suppliers have over us diminishes. And the arguments over who gets the resources between China, India, the U.S., those also diminish. And that we develop the renewable energy technologies. There's no reason that China and India wouldn't want to use the solar power, the wind power. China is already way ahead of the United States in terms of producing solar panels and related technologies. We need to catch up.
Well, I suppose that's the other pieces I want to talk about before we sort of look more at the domestic program that your report talks about is this is not a virgin landscape. In other words, it's not like no one's crossed the starting line yet.
That's right.
Where is the United States relative to India, to China, other countries in terms of innovating in the area of alternative fuels?
Behind. Look, I want to separate out two things, because I do think that energy efficiency, at least for the next 5-10 years should be the leading edge of our investments in a clean energy economy. Renewable energy is very, very important, but it's true, the costs per unit of electricity or to run your car are much higher than fossil fuels. We've got to bring those costs down, and that's research and development. Energy efficiency, we know how to do. We know how to retrofit this building. We know how to retrofit every building. We know how to run a public transportation system that would be much more efficient. We know how to improve the electrical grid. Do those three things. You can reduce energy efficiency in this, reduce energy consumption by, dramatic numbers, 30, 40, 50%. So let's focus on that now. Then on the renewables. We are behind Germany, Spain, China by a lot. Japan in terms of making bullet trains, electric trains, and we need to catch up. Not that I have nothing against Japanese, Chinese businesses, workers, more power to them. At the same time, if, as I believe, this is the wave of the future, this is what is going to transform the global economy over the next generation. We can't just sit back and let it happen. So absolutely, we must invest in the renewable energy sector and get good at it so that we can compete with Germany, Spain, China, Japan, other countries that are already way ahead of us.
Just a couple minutes before the break, and I want to get into the 6 main areas that your report advocates for investment. You already mentioned one, which is conservation.
Right.
What are the other main? Give us the outline of those, and then we can start talking about
them. Well, the ones I picked for that study, those aren't the only ones, but I thought they were important ones. And yes, building retrofits, very important. And I was very happy that Obama has really picked up on that big time. The second one is public transportation. The third one is the electrical grid. And then renewable energy sources, solar, wind, and biomass were the ones that I focused on. There's others. Geothermal's important, hydroelectric's important, but those are the things that I was focusing on.
In regard to conservation, we've heard about conservation for many years, and yet you hear this as kind of a will problem. What is it going to take to get people to put energy efficient light bulbs in their house? Or is it a question of changing fundamental behaviors, or is it a question of sort of the public investment side to make this happen?
I think it's more the public investment side. I think, look, I'm a homeowner, it is a bother. Even if somebody comes and tells me, you make this investment, it's not that much, $3,000, $4,000, it'll reduce your electric bill by 30%. And that means, in 3 years, it'll pay for itself. Well, I still have to come up with the money. I don't know who to call. And then it does take 3 years to get my money back, and I might be very tight now. So what we need is, and the Obama stimulus program does have provisions for this, what we need is, good support from the government. We need subsidies from the government. They have been there. But what we don't have is the infrastructure of intermediation. What we need are both private businesses and the public sector making it easy, indeed making it profitable for people to be the intermediary and say, okay, you call me up, I'll take care of the whole thing. I know how to put this package together. I can get you the loan. Or even utility companies saying, we take the loan, and you don't see anything until your bill goes down in 3 years.
Let's leave it there for our break,
okay.
And we'll come back in just a moment here on International Focus.
Okay.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about the green recovery with Professor Robert Pollin of the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. And Robert, I sort of cut you off a bit. You're talking about the incentives, the investments that could be made in making it easier for people to make that conversion.
Right.
And the thought I had just before we broke was that sounds like a whole another sector for economic growth there in terms of an industry that could be people that would go in and say, you know, I can give you a complete blueprint here to do this.
Yeah. It's sitting there. It's waiting to happen. There are provisions in the stimulus program for that. They're very significant subsidies. I mean, I know that because I've actually been studying it as a consultant to the Department of Energy. I know the details of these incentive programs. They're big. You know, it's like $100 billion worth of potential incentives. So, you know, we need creative entrepreneurs that want to get in the middle and be the intermediary and say, I can connect these homeowners with, you know, the contractors, with the banks, and put it together. And maybe, you know, the banks or the utility companies or somebody can assume some of the risk so that the homeowner is not on the hook until their bill starts going down. These are the things that need to be happening now.
What are we talking about? You talked about this as being the single biggest area that we could make an efficiency gain here. What, on order of magnitude in terms of percentage of energy usage, what have you looked at that in terms of how much is possibly at stake there we could be gaining as an economy?
Well, the building retrofits, I think, is the lowest lying fruit, which is why President Obama seems to be emphasizing it a lot in his discussions. It also has the advantage that it can apply to every community. A community of structures, they can all be retrofitted. You can create a lot of jobs in any community. And yes, you can get, you know, for a relatively modest investment, for say an average size house, say $3,000 of an investment in a retrofit, you can get a full payback in 3 years, and you can reduce your energy consumption by 30%. Now, the building's consumption of fossil fuel energy is the single biggest consumer of energy. So if imagine that all the buildings, I mean, I know it's not realistic, imagine every building could reduce its energy consumption by 30% over the next 5 years, and that is roughly 20% of all the consumption. You know, you're reducing by, you know, a lot, 6-7%. That's a lot. And it can be done now. And, you know, there's no new technological breakthroughs that need to happen. We have construction workers that are unemployed. We have 1 million. There's a lot of work that can be done immediately. And yes, at the same time, we should be investing in advancing the renewable energy technologies, but they're going to pay off maybe in 7 or 8 years.
Well, so the conservation, public transportation, electrical grid go more to the consumption side. We need more efficient on how we consume.
Yes.
And then we have the supply side. Let's talk about public transportation for a minute. Again, an area which traditionally has been held back both by the public investment issue, but also because of people saying, bus lines, yes, but not on my street, or right. Subway stop, yes, but not in my neighborhood. Right. What needs to change to get us to make a significant investment in the public transportation side?
Well, I mean, you know, I've read polling data. 99% of the people use cars, or at least the spending on transportation, 99% is cars. And that's across the board, from rich to poor. And why? The main reason is inconvenience. So you've got to get over that threshold where somebody can realistically think, other than in major big cities like New York, where it is. Look at in New York, people use public transportation. It's convenient. Rich people use the subway. So it's got to get to the point where people don't have to think about changing buses 5 times, waiting for 20 minutes between lines. And so that has to be step one, so that we start to think about how you get a transportation system to work, and then you will get significant jumps. We are already seeing significant increases in the use of public transportation that started when oil prices went up so much. Last year, people used public transportation more than in any year since like in the last 30 years. Now, on top of that, if we, with this new wave of investment, and we actually start making it usable, user-friendly for people, then I think you will see a shift. And maybe, people start using, 1 car per family instead of 2 cars per family. Start thinking about public transportation as something they can do even in an evening. Or if they have working a night shift, they can envision that they can get on a bus or a train that'll get them home easily. That's, I think, the major breakthrough that needs to happen along those lines, and the investments have to work in that direction.
And you also talk about the smart electrical grid. Help us, I think most people understand the concept of electrical grid generally, which is how energy gets from the producing, the plants that produce the energy to those that consume the energy.
Right.
What does the smart electrical grid mean?
Well, the dumb electrical grid that we now have is dumb for a couple of reasons. Number one, in the transmission of electricity from point A to point B, it's inefficient. We lose a lot. So that if we had simply had a better set of trunk lines that were able to carry the electricity more efficiently without consuming as much energy to get there, that would be step one.
Is this analogous to people know in their neighborhoods they've seen the trucks laying the fiber optic cables?
Yes.
Are we talking that kind of connectivity?
Yes. Okay. But that would be one step. Another problem is that the electrical grid is not able to integrate the renewable energy sources, solar and wind, that operate on the basis of intermittency. It's not always sunny, it's not always windy. And the electrical grid system now is not very good at storing the electricity that's generated when there's sun, when there's wind, holding it, and then moving it during periods where it's fallow in terms of the new sources. So those would be 2 of the basic things that need to be done.
We've got about 5 minutes, and we've got a huge basket of renewable energy sources, new technologies to talk about there. I'm wondering if you could first identify what are some of those technologies. People know generally wind, solar. They hear about biofuels. They might see it in their gas in terms of ethanol. What are we talking about in terms of those sources and those technologies?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to overcomplicate it, and the things you mentioned cover a lot of the territory. So let's not think that this is this huge, really obscure problem. It's solar power. Ultimately all this stuff comes from sun power. It's solar power, it's wind. You can have offshore wind, you can have onshore wind. You can have biomass. Now the problem that people are becoming increasingly aware of with using corn ethanol is that corn is also used for food. So the higher demand that we have for corn for energy, that raises prices for food and hurts especially poor people where food is a high percentage of their overall consumption basket. So in that area we want to shift to non-food sources of supply stocks. Wood chips. In my own university at UMass, people are doing research on how to really use wood chips efficiently. There's other sources. Algae, people are researching that. We don't know how it's going to work out. Geothermal energy, which is basically you dig a hole in the ground and the temperatures are more temperate and don't change as much. So you bring up, when it's hot out, you bring up the cooler 50-degree air from the ground, and when it's cold you also bring up to 50 degree. So those are the there's variations on those, and people have this image that it's otherworldly, and some of the who knows what's going to really be the thing that really works. But for the most part, those are the things that we need to push forward on. Now, solar energy, for example, we use the solar panels and photovoltaic cells. But there's new technologies already coming, the so-called thin films, which rather than having these big panels, you have really thin films that do the same job, and you can just lay out the films rather than hammering on these big, heavy panels onto buildings. So this is emerging, vastly important and interesting with a lot of opportunities, but I think it's going to take a decade to get it going.
You mentioned earlier the issue of sort of unit cost, that it just costs more,
Yes.
whether it's wind or solar or geothermal, whatever, than you can get from fossil fuels. So for some, they hear that and say, well, we can't fight nature. If it's just more expensive, it's just more expensive. It's not ultimately going to work. Is it a question of just sort of, are these barriers to unit costs and so on insurmountable?
Well, absolutely not. Whale oil was way cheaper than petroleum 100 years ago. So, of course you can get the technologies. It's gonna take some time. But right now, for the most part, fossil fuels are cheaper if, and this is an important if, right now we do not take into account the cost to the environment of burning fossil fuels. We don't. So, you know, it's dumping it into the atmosphere. Now, once we take account of those things, the differential in costs diminish a lot. But be that as it may, we still need to get solar, wind, other renewable energy sources to the point where they're cheaper. And we can get there. And that's, again, an important project that's probably going to take 10 years. Over the next 10 years, we've got a huge amount to do in the area of energy conservation.
We've got just about a minute left, and I'm wondering if you had some advice for the viewers of the show or those who are not in policy-making positions or professors. What can they do on this issue?
Well, okay, start with your dwelling. If you own your own home, you'll save a lot of money. If you invest in a retrofit, if you get energy efficient appliances, you'll be very surprised to find out you can save 30, 40. I've been working with a consultant on this. You know, if you invest $7,000, you can probably save 50 or 60%. There is a huge amount of money lying there waiting to be grabbed.
Great. Robert Pollin, professor from University of Massachusetts-Amherst. Again, the name of the study is the Green Recovery, right? So to our viewers, look for that. And we thank you very much for watching International Focus. We'll see you next week.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.